Welcome to week 2, everyone, in our journey through the letter of Paul to the Romans. First, want to thank you for some really good conversation this first week, some great contributions to both forum discussions. I think also a kind of probing approach to both the text of Romans and to the secondary readings. Some charitable criticism that I thought was great. So let's keep that kind of tone going as we move ahead, because I think it will serve us well as we try to read Romans together. Just a couple things I want to highlight as you're diving into the material for this week. The first one is to do with what we've been talking about quite a bit as the political nature and dynamic of Paul's gospel. And the second one has to do with his audience, which we've said in several places is primarily non-Jewish, and yet how nevertheless the traditions of interpretation that we've inherited usually have us thinking that Paul is criticizing Judaism and saying how Christianity is better or its fulfillment or something like that. So I want to speak to both of these issues as you're diving into the material for this week. First of all, just briefly, I know that for many of us, the claims of Eliot, Taubes, my own podcast exposition of the first 17 verses of the letter have introduced something new, namely that Paul's gospel has a political edge to it, an anti-imperial edge to it. And I think it's good that we wake up to this. In some ways, it's probably waking up to something that we never should have forgotten or lost sight of, because Paul is a Jew, and Jews for generations, as we learn from books like Daniel or Habakkuk, have been responding to Gentile oppression and invoking God's revelation as a way of engaging and resisting Gentile oppression, surviving it and looking to a future that's even beyond it. So Paul is an heir of that Jewish tradition of political resistance. Obviously, Jesus, for whom Paul is apostle, was a public Jewish figure who was executed by Roman imperial authority in Judea. And so people calling him Lord and organizing community life around his name and his memory is directly sort of in continuation with what was evidently an anti-imperial life, a politically significant life, to the point that he was executed by imperial authority. We could go on, right, about how this is sort of intuitive that the gospel would be political for these reasons. But I think what a lot of us reflect and what we bring to this class and this letter is how the political dynamic of Paul's letter has been kind of domesticated, reclassified as primarily religious. The language for most of us operates in a frame of reference that is not immediately politically relevant, but is more immediately relevant to, say, personal transformation, the fate of the soul, something that we might call spirituality, and not so much with shared community life that is intrinsically public, because it's always part of a larger society. So I understand that that's kind of the frame of reference that many of us have inherited Romans through. And so consequently, to hear that Paul's language might be directly political is a little bit sort of stunning, perhaps. The reason I bring it up, though, is not just to comment on this obvious experience that a lot of us are having in the first week of the class with the readings, but also to maybe offer a word of caution, because we have also inherited a rather narrow understanding of the political, where we think that something's being politically relevant means primarily how it is expressed in a political campaign, or someone's political office, or a particular piece of legislation, or something that corresponds to what a lot of us live as the structures of politics. in our day. And if we force Romans directly into that narrow meaning of political, I think we'll also end up with some distortions, because hopefully you've seen that Paul's gospel is not primarily about just launching a bunch of rhetoric against imperial authorities, nor is it about simply kind of particular acts of public demonstration. Even as I think that kind of rhetoric from prophets and demonstrations of various kinds are an important means of political expression for Christians, what Paul is focused on is especially, I would say, the political power of community life of Christian disciples, and probably not just Christian disciples, but communities where Christians gather with people who are probably not necessarily baptized, but are in various ways parts of the community. But the bottom line is that it's the way that Christians are living in relation to one another and their other neighbors that is, for Paul, the primary theater of the politics of the gospel. And what we're going to do in terms today, for example, in political campaigns, how we're going to relate to a two-party political system, political office, legislation, we want to be mindful, I would say, of how those matters are at least in some way a function of our commitment to a certain life together with one another as well as other neighbors. Just everyday life and how we treat one another, how we share our goods, our power, our wealth, our tables, these kinds of things. As we're going to see, that's the theater where the gospel that Paul is developing in Romans lands, and how people share the table, and how they divide time and observe distinctions in time together. And other modes of political expression are also important, but I think if we neglect this primary theater of community life, local community life, network with other communities, of course, then we'll miss really what the political nature and dynamic of Paul's gospel is in Romans. So that's just one thought for you. The second one has to do with the audience of the letter and this article that I've assigned for this week by Kimber Buell and Johnson Hodge. It's an excellent article, difficult to read in some ways, but I hope you will take the time to digest it, because I think that its content is very important. The way that it relates to the audience of Romans is, first of all, by reminding us that Paul's audience in Romans is primarily non-Jewish. He's not trying to persuade Jews to stop being Jews and to become Christian, or to convince Jews that Christianity completes Judaism and they need to leave Judaism behind, or something like that. As Kimber Buell and Johnson Hodge show, there are all kinds of ways in which Paul is engaged in actually Judaizing non-Jewish people, teaching them what Jews have learned about the law, both its promise and its limits. He is teaching them to follow Jesus, the Jew. As we're going to see later on in the letter, he teaches them to respond meaningfully to the election of Israel, that they are being caught up in a certain way, but in a way that needs to respect the family that God has formed through previous generations that they're now being adopted into, and not simply to regard themselves as replacements of the unfaithful parts of that family. So there are all kinds of ways in which what Paul is teaching is not, Christianity over Judaism, but is an expression of Jewish commitment, and an expression of what we might even call ethnic Jewish commitment, that people of other backgrounds are being formed by through Paul's teaching and the power of Jesus's name among them and in them. So all of this hopefully helps us watch out when Paul says in our text for this week, if you call yourself a Jew, as you'll hear in my podcast exposition of that section of Romans, I don't think that Paul is suddenly treating the audience as a bunch of Jews, but he is responding to a tendency of some of the non-Jewish audience to lay hold of Jewish institutions and embracing Jewish life as a means of gaining judgmental sort of authority or power, boasting in the way that they relate to one another and to others. So that's one, hopefully, outcome of being careful about how we interpret the audience. The other one, though, that is related is, the history of the interpretation of Romans and much of the rest of the New Testament often abides by a binary between Jewishness and Christianness, so that, what it means to be Christian is to overcome the limits of being Jewish, to embrace the universal hope of Christianity, and to leave behind the ethnic particularity of Jewish life. And I think that that is fundamentally wrong, as I've hinted in previous communications, and I just want you to bear in mind this week, and that I think Kimber Buell and Johnson Hodge alert us to. Part of the reason that's significant is that some of the political forces, social forces, economic forces of our day have built themselves up, and I'm thinking here especially of Western white culture and political order, built themselves up as sort of the people who have overcome the limits of Jewishness by becoming Christian and therefore universal. And one of the things that has done is not only created this false sense of purity among people who are Christian from the dominant population, a false sense of completeness, etc., but it's also sort of trafficked historically in the foil of Jewishness, so that Jewishness is that ethnically or ethnocentric particular other that the universal Christian hope and the gift of Christian civilization to the world and democracy and things like that have built themselves on top of. And so by extension, this binary has allowed white Christian people to kind of propagate a myth of ourselves in the world by which other people who are not white find themselves kind of forced to assimilate to, subordinate themselves to. And it's really high time for us to confront this anti-Jewish tendency that has fueled this kind of political dominance, cultural dominance in the world. And for us to recognize that claims to being universal or culturally neutral or not ethnically particular always hide cultural and ethnic particulars in them that end up asserting themselves under the umbrella of supposedly being culturally or politically neutral or innocent, when in fact they're not. And I think Romans is quite aware of this, that there's no culturally or politically neutral place from which people present the gospel. It is always colored and shaped by their own cultural and political particulars. So the point of the gospel is not to minimize those, but to engage them and to bring them to the table for us to negotiate them with one another and to see how God has made us for each other as we grow in a way that's mindful of the different positions of power that we come from, rather than thinking that we all come from essentially the same place and are all going to essentially the same place or something like that. So just warning you again about the binary of Christianity and Judaism, or Christianness and Jewishness, and watching out for that, watching out for how we're making sense of the audience that Paul is addressing. And again, trying to track with what the rhetorical purpose of Paul is in Romans, and not losing sight of that when we wake up to the fact, for example, that there's a political quality to the gospel that Paul is proclaiming, or when we try to make sense of what he's saying about the law. We don't want to jump to easy generalizations that seem intuitive to us about these things. We want to be asking again and again, to what end is Paul saying what he's saying here about the law? What is his political concern with this audience, as is borne out by the flow of the argument of the letter? That's the kind of interpretive question we really want to press so that we don't kind of get sloppy with stuff that is relevant, but not really the point, you might say, that Paul is making. Looking forward to another week of great discussion. Thanks again for the conversation so far, and I'll see more of you in the forums.